And I just think such a small thing for a great joy. And I just love doing that. And we're doing these guitars.
James Burton was someone Elvis Presley trusted completely. For years, James stayed silent, carrying memories, secrets, and stories that never made the headlines. Now, at 85, the legendary guitarist is finally opening up. And what he had to say will change everything you thought you knew. Who was Elvis really? What did James witness that nobody else saw? Join us as we find out. Born to Play, The Early Life of James Burton. James Burton didn't learn to play guitar the way most musicians do. There were no formal lessons, no music teachers, no sheet music spread across a stand. James learned the way some people are simply born to learn, by feel, by ear, and by an instinct that couldn't be explained or replicated. From the moment his fingers found the strings, something clicked, and Louisiana, the state that raised him, gave him everything he needed to find his sound. He was born on August 21st, 1939, in the small town of Dubberly, Louisiana, to parents Guy and Lola Burton. Life in the rural South was humble and quiet, far from the bright lights of any stage. Music was everywhere, though, living in the churches, in the fields, in the radio, crackling through living room speakers on warm southern evenings. James absorbed all of it, and long before he ever performed for anyone, music was already running through him. As a teenager, James picked up his guitar and never put it down. He played for hours, chasing sounds he heard in his head, teaching himself techniques that trained musicians spent years mastering. What made him different wasn't just talent, it was devotion. He wasn't practicing to get better, he was playing because he couldn't stop, and the people around him started to take notice. First his family, then his neighbors, then a town that hadn't expected to produce anyone remarkable. Word spread fast in those small Louisiana communities. This boy from Dubberly had something special. His playing was clean, confident, and full of feeling that seemed far beyond his years. Before long, that reputation reached Shreveport, where the Louisiana Hayride had become one of the most important music programs in the country. Broadcast on radio station KWK, the Hayride was known as the Cradle of the Stars, a place where unknown musicians stepped up and introduced themselves to America. Names like Hank Williams and Johnny Cash had graced its stage, and a young man from Mississippi named Elvis Presley had performed there not long before James arrived. James Burton earned his place on that stage and held it. He was young, yet he played with the authority of someone who had been doing it for decades, and audiences could feel the difference. This wasn't a boy trying to impress anyone. This was someone who had already found himself, and his guitar was simply the way he showed the world who he was. James Burton had started his journey, and the road ahead was about to take him somewhere he never could have imagined. How did a quiet kid from Louisiana end up shaping the sound of one of the biggest teen idols in America? That story starts with a one-way ticket to Hollywood, making history before anyone knew his name. When most teenagers dream about Hollywood, they picture the lights, the fame, the feeling of being somebody. James Burton didn't just dream it. Before he turned 18, he packed up everything he owned, left Louisiana behind, and headed west to Los Angeles with nothing except his guitar and the kind of quiet confidence that only comes when a person knows exactly what they were born to do. It didn't take long for the right door to open. James connected with Ricky Nelson, a young television star whose popularity was exploding across America. Nelson was charming and talented, with a voice that girls swooned over, and a sound that radio stations couldn't ignore. Yet he needed a guitarist who could match his energy and elevate his music. James Burton was that guitarist. He started out playing rhythm, though it didn't take long before he was moved to lead, where his tone and instincts could truly breathe. Their first single together was Believe What You Say, and from that moment, James helped define the rockabilly sound that made Ricky Nelson a household name. For over a decade, James was the voice behind the voice, the musical engine powering Nelson's biggest records and live performances. Fans heard Ricky and fell in love, while musicians heard James and knew they were listening to something rare. Even before the Nelson years had fully taken shape, James had already quietly made history. In 1957, he created the guitar riff for a song called Susie Q, recorded by Dale Hawkins. That riff was sharp, hypnotic, and utterly original. James had actually written the piece as a full instrumental, though Hawkins later added his own lyrics, and somewhere along the way, proper credit never made it back to James. No royalties, no recognition, just a riff that went on to become one of the 500 songs credited with shaping rock and roll, played and covered and admired for generations, while the man who created it stood quietly in the background. It was an injustice that never fully sat right with those who knew the truth, yet James didn't make noise about it. He moved forward, kept playing, and kept creating, because that was simply the kind of man he was. That was simply who he was. By the time the music world started paying closer attention, James Burton had already spent years building something extraordinary from the shadows. His name might not have been on every marquee, yet his fingerprints were on the music everyone loved. What came next would take him even further into the studios, the television stages, and the sessions that shaped an entire generation of American sound. The Session King, life behind the scenes. By the mid-1960s, James Burton had already done more than most guitarists accomplish in a lifetime. He had helped launch Ricky Nelson's career, created one of rock and roll's most enduring riffs, and built a reputation that stretched far beyond Louisiana. James wasn't the type to rest on what he had already built, though. He was restless in the best possible way, always looking for the next musical challenge, the next room where his playing could make something better. In 1965, he joined the house band for a television show called Shindig, a nationally broadcast music program that put him in front of millions of viewers on a regular basis. It was exposure of a different kind, not as a frontman, rather as the steady, reliable force behind whoever stepped up to the microphone. James thrived in that role, understanding instinctively how to serve a song without overpowering it, how to add exactly what was needed and nothing more. As his touring commitments with Ricky Nelson began to slow, his reputation as a session musician began to explode. Studios in Los Angeles wanted him, producers called, and artists requested him by name. James became part of a quiet, elite group of musicians who played on other people's records without fanfare, without credit on the album cover, without the crowd chanting their name. Anyone who knew music, however, knew who was in the room. The list of names he worked alongside reads like a history of American music. The Everly Brothers, Merle Haggard, Glenn Campbell, Johnny Cash, Emmylou Harris, and John Denver. He crossed genres without hesitation, moving from country to folk to rock with the ease of someone who had never believed those boundaries existed in the first place. He played dobro on a Buffalo Springfield track in 1967, contributed to records by Elvis Costello, Graham Parsons, and Joni Mitchell, and left his mark on session after session that went on to become classics. In 2001, the music world finally gave James the formal recognition his career had long deserved. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, with none other than Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones delivering his induction speech, a moment that said everything. Later came the Rockabilly Hall of Fame, the Musicians Hall of Fame, and in 2024, the Country Music Hall of Fame. Rolling Stone magazine placed him at number 24 on their list of the 250 greatest guitarists of all time. Not bad for a self-taught kid from Dubberly, who never needed anyone to show him how. James Burton had mastered the art of letting the music speak, yet soon someone would come calling who would ask him to step into the brightest spotlight of his career, and this time, there would be nothing quiet about it. The call from Elvis, joining the TCB Band. By the late 1960s, James Burton was one of the most respected guitarists in the music business, a man whose name carried weight in every studio and on every stage that mattered. He was busy, constantly in demand, and turning down opportunities that most musicians would have given anything to accept. He had already said no to playing in Bob Dylan's first touring band, and when Elvis Presley came calling for his 1968 comeback television special, James had to decline that too. His schedule simply wouldn't allow it. Then 1969 arrived, and Elvis called again. This time, the offer was different. Elvis wasn't asking for a one-night appearance or a television cameo. He was preparing to return to live performance for the first time in years with a brand new residency in Las Vegas, and he wanted James Burton standing beside him as his lead guitarist. It was the kind of offer that changes a career, and this time, James said yes. What followed wasn't simply joining a band. It was building one from the ground up. Elvis trusted James completely, giving him the responsibility of assembling a group of musicians worthy of the stage they were about to share. Together, they formed what became known as the TCB Band, short for Taking Care of Business, Elvis's personal motto, and a phrase that said everything about how he approached his craft. James was the band leader, the anchor, the musical backbone behind one of the most famous performers who ever lived. Night after night in Las Vegas, as Elvis worked the crowd into a frenzy, there would come a moment when he would turn toward the side of the stage, grin, and call out those three words that became legendary among fans: "Play it, James." Every time, James delivered, clean, precise, and full of fire, giving Elvis exactly what the moment needed. Even the equipment told a story. James had been playing a standard red Fender Telecaster when the Vegas shows began, though he soon arrived at rehearsal with something that raised a few eyebrows. A pink paisley Telecaster covered in swirling, colorful patterns that looked unlike anything else on that stage. James wasn't entirely sure how Elvis would react, yet the moment Elvis saw it, he loved it without hesitation. From that point forward, the pink paisley guitar became one of the most recognizable instruments in rock and roll history. The partnership between James Burton and Elvis Presley was no longer just a professional arrangement. It had become something deeper, built on trust, mutual respect, and a shared love for music done right. The lights of Las Vegas were just the beginning, because the road that lay ahead would take them across the entire country and into the hearts of millions of fans. What did those years on tour really look like? 8 years on the road with the King. From the moment the Las Vegas residency roared to life in 1969, James Burton found himself living inside one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of live music. Night after night, city after city, he stood on stage beside Elvis Presley, playing to audiences that packed arenas from one end of America to the other. These weren't just concerts, they were events, moments that people planned their lives around, shows that left audiences breathless and talking for years afterward. James was at the center of all of it. As band leader of the TCB Band, he wasn't simply playing guitar, he was holding the entire musical performance together, reading the room, following Elvis's energy, and making sure that every note landing behind the King was exactly where it needed to be. Elvis could be unpredictable on stage, spontaneous and electric, and James had the skill and instinct to match him every single time. Even while living that demanding life on the road, James never stopped creating his own music. In 1971, he released a solo album called The Guitar Sounds of James Burton, a record that gave fans a rare chance to hear him fully in the spotlight, showcasing the range, the feeling, and the pure technical mastery that had made him so invaluable to everyone he ever played with. In 1975, and again in 1976, James found time to join Emmylou Harris's Hot Band, one of the most critically admired country rock outfits of the era. He played alongside musicians like Glenn D. Hardin, who was also part of Elvis's world, and Rodney Crowell, contributing to a sound that earned widespread praise. Yet whenever Elvis prepared to head back out on tour, James returned without hesitation. Some of the other musicians stayed on with Emmylou, though James felt a loyalty to Elvis that ran deeper than any scheduling decision. Shortly before Elvis's passing, James was invited to appear on a John Denver television special, a testament to how widely respected he remained, even while committed to one of the world's biggest touring acts. It was another quiet reminder that James Burton's talent opened doors everywhere he went. Those 8 years on the road with Elvis were more than a job. They were a bond forged under stage lights and across thousands of miles of highway, a partnership that neither man took lightly. The crowds always roared, the music always delivered, and James was always ready when Elvis turned and called his name. Yet behind all that energy and spectacle, something was quietly changing, and the summer of 1977 would bring it all to a sudden and heartbreaking end. What really happened during those final shows? The last show, A Goodbye Nobody Saw, coming. The summer of 1977 should have been just another stretch of touring. Elvis had dates booked, venues confirmed, and fans waiting in cities across the country. James Burton had done this hundreds of times before, loading onto the tour, tuning up his pink paisley Telecaster, and taking his place beside the man the whole world had come to see. There was no reason to think this summer would be any different from the ones that came before it. Yet anyone who looked closely could see that something had changed. Elvis was not the same man who had electrified Las Vegas back in 1969. The years of relentless touring, the pressure of maintaining a legend, the physical toll of life lived almost entirely under a spotlight. All of it had worn him down, in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. He was tired, visibly heavier, and dealing with health problems that those around him found deeply troubling. James had watched Elvis push through difficult nights before, though this felt different, more serious, harder to brush aside. In his personal opinion, James later said that tour should have been canceled. He could see what it was costing Elvis to keep going, yet Elvis refused to stop. The stage was where he felt most alive, where everything made sense, and no amount of pain or exhaustion was going to pull him away from his audience. The final concert took place on June 26, 1977, at Market Square Arena in Indianapolis, Indiana. Nobody in that building knew it would be the last time Elvis Presley ever performed live. The crowd had no idea, the band had no idea, and Elvis himself had no idea. He walked out, he sang, he smiled, and when the moment came, he turned to his bandleader one last time and said exactly what he had always said. "Play it, James." After the show, the goodbyes were completely ordinary. There was no long conversation, no emotional farewell, no sense that anything was ending. Elvis was heading back to Graceland to rest before the next leg of the tour, and James flew home to Shreveport expecting to see him again within weeks. He never did. The news arrived on August 16th, and James Burton's world changed forever. The way the world changes when someone you love is suddenly, irreversibly gone. That last concert in Indianapolis became something sacred in James's memory. The final chord, the final nod, the final play it. It's James. A goodbye wrapped inside an ordinary night that nobody knew to treasure until it was already over. The world would soon learn exactly what happened in those final weeks at Graceland, and the details were as heartbreaking as the loss itself. What were Elvis's last hours really like? August 16th, 1977. Elvis's final day. Graceland on the morning of August 16th, 1977, looked like it always did. Quiet, shaded, and still. The Grand Memphis estate that Elvis had made his sanctuary was a place that ran on its own rhythm, one that had little in common with the rest of the world outside its gates. Elvis lived mostly at night, staying awake through the early hours and sleeping through the daylight. And those who shared his world had long since adjusted their own lives to match his. That morning, however, something was off. Elvis couldn't sleep. He had taken his usual medications, though rest wouldn't come, and the discomfort of a persistent toothache, combined with the broader health struggles he had been carrying for years, made the night feel longer and heavier than usual. He had battled insomnia for a long time, and his reliance on prescription medication had quietly become one of the most serious concerns among those closest to him. The man who had once bounded onto stages with limitless energy was now fighting just to get through an ordinary night. He spent part of the early hours with his fiancée, Ginger Alden, the two of them reading quietly and talking in the dim stillness of Graceland. It was a peaceful scene in its own way. Two people sharing the small, private hours that never make it into any headline. At some point, Elvis told Ginger he was going into the bathroom, book in hand, to try and relax. She stayed in the bedroom and waited for him to return. Hours passed. The house stayed quiet. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, Ginger realized Elvis had been gone far too long, and when she went to check on him, she found him lying face down on the bathroom floor, completely unresponsive. She screamed for help immediately, and within moments the household was in chaos. An ambulance was called, paramedics arrived, and Elvis was rushed to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis, with medical staff working desperately to revive him during the journey. It wasn't enough. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Elvis Presley was pronounced dead. The official cause was listed as cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat, though years of prescription pill dependency and serious physical decline were understood to have played a significant role. He was 42 years old. The news spread across the world within hours, landing like a shockwave on everyone who had ever loved his music, which was nearly everyone. A light that had seemed impossible to extinguish had simply gone out. For James Burton, who had stood beside Elvis on countless stages and called him a true friend, the grief was profound and personal. Yet James had stories to tell, memories to share, and a man to honor. What did he remember most about the person behind the legend? But James Burton said about Elvis. There are people who speak about Elvis Presley with reverence because of what he represented. The music, the cultural moment, the icon. James Burton spoke about him differently. When James talked about Elvis, he wasn't describing a legend from a distance. He was remembering a friend, someone he had stood beside through hundreds of nights. someone who had looked out for him the way a brother looks out for family. James described Elvis as sweet, kind, and genuinely considerate in ways that had nothing to do with cameras or public image. Elvis would regularly check in on the members of the TCB band, asking how their families were doing, whether anyone needed anything, whether everything was all right at home. On stage, that same generosity showed up in a different form. No matter how exhausted Elvis was, no matter what he was carrying privately, he stepped into the spotlight and gave the audience everything he had. James said you could feel the sincerity in every performance, that Elvis genuinely loved making people happy, and that leaving a crowd smiling was something he took personally. He gave 100% every single night, not because it was expected, rather because it mattered deeply to him. James also spoke warmly about how much Elvis respected the musicians around him. Elvis listened to the TCB band's instincts and gave them creative freedom. It's trusting them to interpret his songs in ways that made the music better. That kind of respect meant everything to a group of serious musicians who could have been treated as mere backing players. One of the most revealing things James shared was about gospel music. While the world knew Elvis for rock and roll, gospel was the music that truly moved his soul. James believed that if Elvis had lived, he would have devoted himself entirely to recording and performing gospel, that it was where his spirit truly lived. When Elvis sang gospel, James said, something different came over him entirely. For James Burton, Elvis was never just the king of rock and roll. He was a warm, generous, deeply human man who left a permanent mark on everyone lucky enough to know him. The world lost Elvis on August 16th, yet for those who truly knew him, he never really left. So, what did James do with all that grief? And where did his guitar take him next? After Elvis, a career that never stopped. When Elvis Presley passed away in August of 1977, James Burton lost more than a band leader and a professional partner. He lost a close friend, someone who had been a constant presence in his life for nearly 8 years. The TCB band that had traveled the country together, shared late nights and long journeys, and poured everything into those electrifying performances, suddenly had nowhere to go. For many musicians, a loss like that might have meant stepping back, taking time away, letting the grief settle before figuring out what came next. James Burton was not that kind of musician. John Denver reached out not long after Elvis's passing, and the connection between the two men proved immediate and natural. When they came together to work on Denver's album, I Wanna Live, the chemistry was undeniable, and what began as a recording session quickly grew into something much larger. Former Elvis bandmates Glenn D., Hardin, and Jerry Sheff joined in, and before long, James had found a new musical home. For the next 16 years, he played lead guitar for John Denver, contributing to 12 albums and touring the world, alongside one of the most beloved performers of his generation. James even brought along some of the same instruments he had carried through the Elvis years, including his famous 1969 pink paisley Fender Telecaster and his trusty dobro, tools that had helped define one chapter of music history, now helping to write another. In 1995, James and Denver reunited for a special wildlife concert, and those who were there remembered it as something genuinely magical. Sadly, in 1997, John Denver died in a plane crash, and James once again found himself grieving a close friend. He traveled to Aspen, Colorado, to speak at Denver's memorial service, paying tribute to a man who had given him a reason to keep going after Elvis. Through the 1980s and beyond, James kept working with a remarkable range of artists, playing with Merle Haggard, Rodney Crowell, and Emmylou Harris, and beginning a long creative partnership with Elvis Costello in 1986. He appeared in the celebrated Roy Orbison and Friends television special, a concert that brought together some of the finest musicians of an era and gave James another chance to remind the world what pure guitar playing sounded like. From 1998 through 2013, James toured with Elvis the Concert, a live production that reunited Elvis's former bandmates and brought the King's music back to new generations through a combination of live performance and archival footage. James Burton had refused to let loss define him, choosing instead to let music carry him forward the way it always had. The honors, the comebacks, and the milestones were still ahead, and the most remarkable chapters of his later years were only just beginning. What did those final decades of recognition and resilience really look like? Elvis Presley, a heart as big as his fame. Elvis Presley gave the world his voice, his energy, and his music, Yet those who knew him best will tell you that the greatest thing he ever gave was far simpler than any of that. It was his kindness, offered freely, consistently, and almost always without anyone watching. From the earliest days of his success, Elvis made giving a natural part of his life. He didn't announce it, didn't seek coverage for it, and rarely spoke about it himself. When he heard that someone was struggling and he had the means to help, he helped. He once paid off a complete stranger's mortgage without revealing who had done it, and stories like that, one followed him throughout his entire life. A man standing at a gas station short on money would walk away with enough for fuel and groceries, never knowing who had quietly covered it. His generosity reached far beyond individuals. Elvis donated President Roosevelt's former yacht to raise funds for St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. He gave a concert in Hawaii in 1961 to raise thousands for the U.S.S. Arizona Memorial, and in 1973, performed his Aloha from Hawaii concert in front of over 1 billion viewers worldwide, donating every penny of the profits to the Kiki Lee Cancer Fund. Every Christmas, he quietly donated $1,000 each to 50 different Memphis charities, expecting nothing in return. He bought wheelchairs for strangers, funded surgeries for people who couldn't afford them, and donated teddy bears sent to him by fans directly to children's hospitals, so that children going through the hardest moments of their young lives would have something to hold. After his passing in 1977, his family ensured that spirit lived on through the Elvis Presley Charitable Foundation, which continues supporting arts, education, children's programs, and Presley Place, a Memphis shelter helping homeless families rebuild their lives. Elvis was the king of rock and roll, though to those he helped quietly and without fanfare, he was simply a good man,